My daughter sent me a text. Just 5 words. We are cutting ties now. I stood in the kitchen holding the same wooden spoon I had used to feed her as a child. She didn't call. She didn't explain. That night I turned off my phone. By morning I had 77 missed calls. But the thing is, I had already walked away. What came next? Even she couldn't take back. I was standing in my kitchen just after sunrise, flipping the last batch of cornbread over a cast-iron skillet that still held the smell of hickory smoke from the night before. The walls around me were soaked in memories. Elmer's laughter echoing through the rafters, muddy boots at the door after a long hike. Melanie's little fingers reaching for warm biscuits while her hair curled from the mountain air. That morning was still, the kind of still that comes before something cracks. I didn't hear her car pull in, but I saw the glint of new tires through the screen door. Melanie had arrived 2 days earlier, unannounced, with a suitcase in one hand and a laptop in the other. She had kissed my cheek lightly, said she was home for a while. I had believed her. She said she wanted to help reimagine the place. I thought she meant repaint the shutters. I remember her face lit up that first evening when she talked about branding and potential. She spoke fast, like she was in a meeting, not in her mother's kitchen. There were words I didn't recognize. Conversion funnels, scalable growth, heritage packaging. I tried to listen. I really did. But what I remember most was the smell of burnt butter because I had left the skillet too long on the stove. She said people loved authenticity and that we had it if we packaged it right. I looked around that morning. Nothing needed packaging. The old floor creaked the same way it always had. The curtains still smelled of sage and wood smoke. When she walked in, she barely looked at the food, just held up her phone. A photographer was coming. She needed some images to build the story. I asked if she wanted me to wear the apron Elmer had stitched my name on back in 1983. She smiled, like I had said something quaint. Then she laughed. Not mean, just distant. They arrived in a car that cost more than this house ever did. I was told kindly to step aside. Better light near the window. So I went back to the stove and stirred the beans. When the camera clicked, I heard them call the place Maple & Co. No one asked who made the beans. If you've ever felt the air shift in a room where you once felt needed, you'll understand. I didn't get angry that day, but I did feel something leave me. If you've ever poured your soul into something and watched someone repackage it with a smile, stay with me. Because that's when the story truly began. The next morning I woke up early like always. The mountain air was cooler than usual, and the windows fogged with breath and pine. I tied my hair back and reached for the same blue cardigan I had worn for years. It was soft at the elbows, thinned with time, but it was mine. Downstairs, I could already hear Melanie pacing, voice clipped and low, on a call. She was in my late husband's office, which had been untouched for nearly a decade. She had asked if she could work there temporarily. I had said yes without thinking. Now the door was shut. I went about making breakfast. I ground the coffee beans by hand, cracked eggs into the cast-iron pan, and sliced the tomatoes that had ripened on the vine near the porch. I wasn't expecting thanks, but it used to matter to someone. When she emerged, her heels clicked across the floor like they didn't belong there. She was dressed in pressed slacks and a silk blouse, hair tied back in that tight way that makes a person look both younger and colder. She looked at the spread I had set out. I pulled out a chair. She said she had an early video meeting and grabbed only a banana. I nodded, swallowed what I was about to say, and sat down alone. Later that afternoon, 2 young men arrived in a van with equipment. They set up lighting in the living room and moved the rocking chair into the corner without asking. A woman with a clipboard walked through the kitchen taking notes like she was surveying a property for resale. Melanie followed behind them, directing things. She spoke with her hands now like a television producer. She had changed the framed photos in the hallway. The ones of my parents on their wedding day were gone, replaced with high-contrast shots of the mountains printed in black and white. The shelf that once held mason jars of dried herbs and family cookbooks now displayed clean beige ceramic bowls with sprigs of lavender for accent. Melanie called it staging. She said the camera loved neutrality. That evening she showed me mock-ups on her laptop. There was a sleek new logo, maple and comedy, clean lines, gold lettering. The font reminded me of something you'd see in a bank window. She had already purchased the domain, built a newsletter. When I asked where my name would appear, she said the brand was bigger than either of us now. It wasn't cruel, just finished. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and went to boil water for tea. Later that night, I walked past the front office. The lights were still on. Through the doorframe, I saw her typing fast, her face lit by the glow of the screen. She looked determined, capable, like someone who always knew what she wanted. But I also saw something else. A photo of her and Elmer had been moved to a drawer, the one they took on the last hike before his diagnosis. He had his arm around her shoulders, both of them squinting into the sun. It was folded in half. I closed the drawer quietly. The next day, boxes arrived. Branded napkins, paper menus, product tags for future merchandise. There were tasting spoons made of recycled bamboo with the maple and compiel initials etched near the tip. The photographer came back for more pictures. This time, a stylist was with her. They asked if I had any solid color clothing. I brought out my Sunday dress. The one Elmer used to say made me look like spring itself. The stylist smiled politely and placed it back on the hanger. She handed me a beige apron. Melanie said it was more on brand, so I wore it. They had me stand by the stove holding a pot of beans I didn't cook. They told me to smile softly like I was remembering a warm story. I did what they asked. I smiled, but my chest ached. That night I sat on the porch with a cup of weak coffee and listened to the wind. The old signs Elmer had carved by hand still leaned against the side of the house. One of them had a crack down the middle, just like everything else lately. I told myself maybe it was just a phase, a new version of us. Maybe Melanie needed to do things her way for a while. Maybe letting go was part of growing older. But deep down I knew. This wasn't a remodel, it was an erasure. The next afternoon, I stood near the kitchen doorway, wiping my hands on a faded dish towel, as Melanie's team gathered around the dining table. They had cleared off everything placemats, candles, even the table runner Elmer's mother had crocheted decades ago. In its place sat a MacBook, a few glossy printouts, and a tray of store-bought pastries. Melanie clicked through slides on her screen. Her voice was upbeat, measured like she was pitching an idea to strangers. I wasn't invited to the meeting. I hadn't been told about it at all. But I could hear every word. She spoke about brand, story, legacy, rural luxury. She called the house a backdrop. She called me a visual element. She called my food rustic charm. When someone asked about the recipes, she laughed lightly and said they came from inspiration and local memory. No mention of the binder in my kitchen drawer, the one filled with handwritten notes. My handwriting. Elmer's scribbled corrections. They passed around a brochure mock-up. I saw the cover. Maple & Co. A taste of timeless comfort. There was a woman on the front, grey hair, warm smile, holding a pie. But it wasn't me. They had used a stock photo. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the wind batter the porch screen and the creak of tree limbs shifting outside. Something inside me felt sore, like a pulled muscle you don't remember straining, but you feel every time you move. At 3 a.m, I got up. I lit the old lamp on the kitchen counter and opened the drawer. The binder was still there. I flipped through pages yellowed at the edges, some stained with cinnamon, others warped from steam. Each recipe told a story, not just ingredients and steps, but notes on who liked it when we made it what it meant. I ran my fingers over the page for the apple butter cake. Elmer had written too much nutmeg and underlined it twice. I had never agreed, but I never changed it. The next morning, I sat at the table and watched Melanie walk in, face glued to her phone. I asked her to sit. Just for a minute. She looked up, briefly said she was running late and moved toward the door. I told her I wanted to talk about the name, about the way things were being framed. She paused. Just a beat. Then she said gently that things evolve, that personal touches were still there, just reinterpreted. She said I should trust the process. She said I was overthinking it. She smiled, kissed my head, and left. I sat there long after the door closed. That afternoon I walked the property, past the old shed, down by the creek where Melanie once fell in trying to catch frogs. The air was heavy with late summer heat and the sound of cicadas. I noticed something strange. The sign on the road had been taken down, the one that read E&E, shelter, carved by hand in cedar. In its place, propped against the fence, was a sleek wooden plank. Blank. No one had asked. No one had said a word. Later that day, I checked the website Melanie had registered. I didn't know much about technology, but I knew enough to find the About page. It mentioned tradition. It mentioned a mountain upbringing. It even mentioned family inspiration. But it didn't mention my name. Not once. I searched again. I clicked through every page, every section. My face wasn't there. My voice wasn't there. The kitchen I had cooked in for 40 years was there, but it was just a background, a setting. I closed the laptop slowly. My hand stayed on the lid a little longer than it needed to. That evening I didn't cook. I didn't light the stove. I opened a can of soup and sat at the far end of the porch. I watched the last light bleed across the treetops. Melanie didn't come home until after dark. She had brought a guest. A woman with a camera and high heels stepping carefully across the gravel. They spoke in low voices, laughed once. Then Melanie pointed toward the back garden. My garden. The one Elmer and I had planted. The one I still tended. They took pictures. She posed beside the tomato vines, reached for a sunflower, tilted her head toward the light. The woman took dozens of shots. None had me in them. And that's when I knew. It wasn't just branding. It wasn't just style. I was being removed, not all at once, but piece by piece, quietly, effortlessly, like I had never been there. 2 mornings later, the sun had barely touched the ridgeline when I stepped outside with my coffee. The porch was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to bring me comfort. But now even the wind seemed unsure where it belonged. I walked toward the mailbox. The gravel shifted under my slippers, still damp from the early dew. Inside the box was a thick envelope addressed to Maple & Co. The name felt foreign in my hands, not because I didn't recognize it, but because I did and knew it no longer included me. Inside were registration papers. Melanie had filed to establish the property as a commercial venue. I scanned the fine print. The language was polished, but the meaning was blunt. Every square inch of the land was now listed under a limited liability corporation. Her name sat alone on the forms. The house I had lived in for 42 years. The land Elmer had cleared with his own hands. The creek where Melanie used to float twigs and call them ships. All of it now legally hers. I stood in the kitchen and placed the envelope on the counter. I didn't move for a long while. My fingertips brushed the edge of the paper again and again, as if I was waiting for the words to change. Later that afternoon, Melanie came in talking fast, her words tumbling over each other. Investors were interested. A regional lifestyle blog had posted about our up-and-coming Appalachian experience. There was talk of expanding to pop-up shops and branded jams. She didn't see the envelope. I asked her if she planned to stay long-term. She said she was rooting here for a while. I don't think she realized what that sounded like. That night I couldn't eat. The air in the house felt too tight. I opened the windows, but it didn't help. I walked out to the shed. Elmer's old fishing rod was still hanging from a nail. The workbench held his tools in perfect order, untouched. I sat on the stool and closed my eyes. I remembered the day he built the back porch, how we had no money for contractors, so we measured every beam twice, how he whistled while sawing, how Melanie had painted the railing with little sunflowers, her hands covered in yellow for a week. That version of her hadn't left me. Not yet. The next morning I made a decision. I didn't tell anyone. I just quietly began gathering documents, property titles, tax receipts, copies of the original deed. I kept them in a folder and slid it under my mattress. Not out of fear, out of clarity. That evening, Melanie asked me to look over a menu draft. She had included avocado toast, lavender tea, and vegan chili. I asked about the apple butter cake. She said it felt too old-fashioned for the image they were building. Old-fashioned. That word landed harder than I expected. She patted my hand, told me not to take things personally. I smiled and nodded. The next day, 2 representatives from a regional food company came to tour the house. One wore boots that had never touched mud. The other carried a tablet and kept pointing at corners, talking about natural light and photo angles. They were kind, polite, but they didn't ask for me. They asked for Melanie. I stayed in the pantry until they left, not hiding, just choosing where I belonged. That evening I baked the apple butter cake anyway. The scent filled the kitchen. Warm spices, slow-baked apples, and cinnamon that clung to the air like memory. I placed it on the counter with 2 forks. Melanie came in an hour later, saw the cake, and smiled like it was a relic. She took 1 bite, said it was good, said it reminded her of something, though she couldn't say what. Then she walked away. That was the moment something changed in me. Not anger, not sadness, just a clear line. I washed the forks, dried the counter, and walked out to the porch. The wind had picked up. Clouds were gathering beyond the far ridge. I sat down slowly and let the night come. The next morning I made my bed, folded the laundry, and called a woman named Lois who lived 2 counties over. She used to run a legal clinic out of a church basement. We hadn't spoken in years, but she answered like no time had passed. I told her I needed to ask a few questions about land use inheritance rights and transfer protections. She didn't ask why. She just said, "Let's begin." I hung up and made tea. Melanie was in the kitchen, voice bright and fast, on another call. She mentioned funding, a second location, licensing the brand. I poured the tea and stepped out onto the porch. My hands were steady. My breath was calm. I knew what I had to do, not out of spite, but because someone had to remember what mattered, and I wasn't going to wait for permission. The next morning I woke up before the birds. The house was quiet, but not in the way it used to be, not restful, just empty. I made myself a single cup of coffee. No eggs, no toast, just the bitter strength of something I could still control. I pulled out the manila folder I had tucked beneath the mattress and sat by the window in the guest room. The papers were all there. Photocopies of old deeds, tax records, and something I hadn't touched in years. The handwritten letter Elmer left with our lawyer just weeks before his passing. He had never been good at big speeches. But in that short letter, he had written one clear line: This place belongs to Evelyn until her last breath. I held on to those words. That day, Melanie was out visiting potential partners. She had started using that word for everyone now. Partners. Not friends, not neighbors, not even people. It gave me time to work. I called Lois again and asked her to meet me at the library in Cedar Hill. We sat in the back, near the genealogy section, away from curious eyes. She was still sharp, still fast. She read through the papers with her lips pressed tight, nodding slowly. She gave me 3 options. The third one caught my breath. I could transfer the homestead, the original house and garden area, into a protected trust. Something separate from the new LLC Melanie had created. It wouldn't undo what had already been filed, but it would carve out a boundary, a line no one could legally cross without my consent. It wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be public, but it would be real, and it would mean something. We filed the paperwork that afternoon, simple signatures, a few notary stamps. It took less than 40 minutes to do what I should have done 10 years ago. When I returned home, Melanie was hosting 2 couples on the back porch. They were from Asheville, she said, big on experience-based dining. They were sipping chilled herbal tea from mason jars I had once used for summer peach preserves. I watched from the kitchen as Melanie laughed with them, pointing toward the hills like they were hers to offer. Later she came in flushed and excited, said we had interest from a regional distributor, asked if I would consider baking some of the old recipes again for show not sale. She said it would add credibility. I nodded and asked her if she could help me bring in the clothes off the line. She blinked, said she had a call in 10 and disappeared up the stairs. I walked out alone and pulled the sheets down one by one. The air smelled like honeysuckle. Somewhere in the distance, a tractor moved slow across the next ridge. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my journal. I hadn't written in weeks. But that night, the words came fast. I wrote about silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that replaces you, that dulls your voice until even you forget how it once sounded. I wrote about Elmer's hands, how they knew the land like a second language, how they carved every fence post with care, not speed. I wrote about Melanie's laugh when she was 5, how it sounded like wind chimes. And I wrote about the line I had drawn, not for war, but for remembering. The next day, I cooked for myself, real food, pinto beans with ham skillet cornbread and stewed okra. I ate on the back steps with the sun warming my face. No camera, no setup, just me. Melanie passed by, rushing to a meeting. She didn't notice the food. That night, the porch light burned out. I didn't replace it. Instead, I lit a candle in the window. Just one. When I passed the mirror on the way to bed, I caught a glimpse of myself. Not tired, not bitter. Still here. Still the woman who knew where every creak in the floorboard lived. Still the one who remembered which herbs thrived on which side of the shed. Still Evelyn. And for the first time in weeks, I felt solid again. No applause, no victory dance, just still. Like the roots under this house, not loud, but too deep to move. The phone buzzed just after 7 a.m. I was pouring feed into the henhouse trough when I heard it echo from the kitchen window. By the time I got to it, the screen showed 6 missed calls, all from Melanie. She hadn't called that often since the week her father passed. I didn't return the calls, not yet. Instead, I walked to the garden. The marigolds had started to wilt near the base, and the basil needed trimming. I worked in silence, hands in the soil, letting the noise of the morning settle. A sparrow landed on the fence post, the same one I'd seen 3 mornings in a row, still alone. Inside, Melanie had left a note on the counter. Running late. Can we talk tonight? I folded the paper and placed it in the drawer next to the tin of matches and prayer cards. I wasn't ready to talk, at least not on her schedule. That evening she came home earlier than usual. No phone in her hand, no fast-talking energy, just a quiet stiffness that clung to her shoulders. She stood near the doorway like a stranger, unsure if she was welcome. Then she asked if we could sit. I nodded and pulled out the chair across from mine. She said the blog post had gone viral. People were asking to visit to book stays to order kits. She paused, then told me something I didn't expect. She said a producer from a national show had reached out, wanted to feature our mother-daughter legacy. She smiled like that would move me, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. She added that the producers wanted me in the piece, in the kitchen, holding a rolling pin, laughing probably, maybe even wearing that old apron. I asked her why now. She didn't answer, just looked down at her hands, twisting the hem of her sleeve. She said she had been trying to build something lasting, that I should be proud. I told her the house was already lasting, that love didn't need rebranding. Her jaw tightened. Just a flicker, but enough to see it. She asked why I had spoken with Lois. I didn't ask how she knew. She always had a way of finding out. I told her the truth. I said I had protected what I could, not from her, but for me. She asked if I thought she was the enemy. I told her I thought she had forgotten what home means. She stood then, said she needed air. The door closed quietly behind her. I sat alone for a while, listening to the night, no words left to rearrange. The next morning she was gone before I woke, left a full pot of coffee a rarity. The week that followed was quiet. She moved around the house like a guest, polite, efficient, absent, until Thursday. I was on the porch shelling peas into an enamel bowl when a man pulled into the drive. He wore a blazer and smiled too wide, introduced himself as a media consultant, said he was there to talk about the shoot, said he'd brought a team to scout lighting, said they had brought props but wanted to use some authentic elements. He looked at me like I was one of them. I nodded and led him inside, showed him the pantry, the spice rack, the sunlit corner where I had rocked Melanie to sleep when she had colic. He took notes, pointed his phone around, snapped pictures without asking. Then he saw the framed photo near the stove. Elmer and me, our first summer here. Dirt under our nails and 2 smiles full of grit. He paused, said maybe we could use that. Maybe crop it. I said nothing, just reached for the frame and turned it face down. He didn't understand. He thanked me, told me I'd be great on camera. Then he left. That night, Melanie sat beside me on the porch for the first time in weeks. No phones, no lists, just the 2 of us and the creak of wood beneath our feet. She asked if I was angry. I said no. I was tired. She said she wanted to make things right. I said then stop turning me into a product. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said maybe it had gone too far, that she'd gotten caught up, that she just wanted people to see what I had built. I told her I didn't need people to see it. I just needed her to remember it. She didn't reply, but she stayed, and that was more than I had expected. By midnight, the house was still. I stood by the kitchen window looking out at the pasture. Somewhere in the dark, a fox barked once. Then silence. In the stillness, I knew this wasn't the end of the fight, but it was the first time I felt she heard me, not as a brand, but as her mother, and that for now was enough to hold on to. The following morning, the dew was thick across the grass, sparkling beneath the first streaks of light. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee and wrapped the shawl tighter around my shoulders. The air had changed, still warm, but carrying the scent of fading summer. Something in it told me the season was shifting not just outside, but inside the house, too. Melanie had been quieter since that night on the porch. She still answered calls and took meetings, but her voice was softer, her eyes more tired. I could see she was trying to hold everything in place, but something inside her had begun to loosen. By noon, she asked if I wanted to come with her to the general store in town. We hadn't gone anywhere together in months. I said yes. We rode in silence most of the way, passing familiar stretches of land that had grown wilder since Elmer left. The road twisted through maple groves and goldenrod fields, the landscape soft in its age. When we pulled into the parking lot, I noticed her hesitation before turning off the engine. Inside the store, she chatted with the cashier, pointing out a few local jams and noting where to source the labels. I wandered past the canning supplies to the shelves lined with soaps and old tins of honey. There was a small section of local goods with a photo of the original store owners from the 1950s. Two women aprons dusted with flour standing in front of crates of preserves. Their smiles weren't posed, just real. I stood there longer than I meant to. When we got home, Melanie brought in the groceries and asked if I'd help her test a new version of the menu. She'd added the apple butter cake back in, called it Evelyn's Hearth Slice. I didn't answer at first. I just kept folding the tea towels in the drawer neat and even. Then I said her name. Not with anger, just enough to stop her. I told her I wouldn't be a slice or a story. I told her I could bake if I wanted to, but I would never be a concept. She blinked, stood still, then placed the recipe draft on the counter and walked out. Later I heard her on the phone. Her voice was shaking. I couldn't hear the words, just the sharp edge of someone trying not to cry while still sounding in control. That night I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in the chair beside the fireplace and read Elmer's old journal. Page after page of planting notes, seasonal rhythms, and scattered reflections. One entry stopped me. If it ever gets too shiny, it ain't real anymore. I traced the line with my finger and closed the book. The next morning I found Melanie sitting on the back steps. No makeup, no calls, just her and the wind rustling through the trees. She asked me how I had kept things steady all those years. I told her I didn't. I just showed up every morning and paid attention. She didn't speak after that. But she sat there a long time. 2 days later, the production team arrived. They came in vans with wires, soft lights, racks of carefully chosen authentic clothing, and a checklist longer than the porch railing. One of them wore headphones and barked timing cues. Another adjusted my curtains like they were part of a movie set. I watched from the hallway as they rearranged the kitchen. My cookbooks were swapped for vintage props. The fresh beans I had just snapped were replaced with wooden lookalikes. It wasn't real, and it never had been their story to tell. Melanie saw me watching. I turned to go, but she called after me. She said she had told them to stop filming. I didn't turn back. She caught up with me outside, her voice lower now. She said it didn't feel right, that she had stood in the kitchen and realized she didn't recognize the place anymore. Not because of the cameras, but because I wasn't in it. She said she couldn't sell something she didn't understand. I looked at her then, really looked, and I saw her. Not the woman with the pitch decks and marketing plans, just my daughter. The girl who once held her breath to blow on dandelions and whispered wishes into the wind. I told her if she wanted to understand, she'd have to let go first. Of the story she had been trying to write, and of the version of herself that thought everything had to be packaged. That night, she sent the crew home. No announcements, no long explanations, just a quiet end. The porch light stayed off, and for the first time in months, the house exhaled. The morning after the film crew left the house felt like it belonged to itself again. There were no tripods by the stairs, no lighting kits on the porch, just the soft hum of the fridge, the creak of wood under bare feet, and the slow rhythm of a home that had returned to breathing. I stood by the sink, washing two mugs, one for coffee, one for tea, the kind of quiet task that centers the soul. The wind slipped in through the cracked window above the sink. It carried a lightness I hadn't felt in months. Melanie came downstairs, still in her robe. She moved slower, more deliberate, like the pace of the house was starting to settle into her bones, too. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't open her laptop. She poured herself some coffee and sat at the kitchen table without saying a word. We sat like that for a long while. Later that afternoon, she came out to the garden. I was trimming back the mint, where it had started to crawl into the lettuce beds. She crouched down next to me, pulled her sleeves up, and started thinning out the chives. We worked in silence the way people do when their hands know more than their mouths. Eventually, she told me she had called off the expansion plans, said she refunded the deposits, closed out the blog accounts. She said the sponsors weren't happy. There were penalties, late fees, and she would take the loss. But she said she was done pretending. I didn't respond. I just handed her the garden scissors when she reached for them. That night we cooked together. Not for photos, not for an audience, just for us. We used her grandmother's cast iron skillet, the one with the chipped handle but perfect weight. Fried green tomatoes, cornbread in the oven, and a pot of Crowder peas simmering slow. The kind of meal that pulls memories out of the walls. We ate by candlelight on the back porch. The stars came out one by one. No music, no camera clicks, just the cicadas and the sound of a screen door settling into its hinges. The next morning she asked if we could take a drive to the north pasture. We hadn't been out that far since the winter before Elmer passed. The gravel was rough, but the truck still made it. The sky stretched wide over the hill clouds, slow dancing across the blue. She pointed to the old cabin at the edge of the trees. Said she had a thought. Maybe it was time to let the land rest. No tents, no tours, no brand. Just land. Let it be what it was meant to be. She looked at me, then waiting. I told her I'd been letting it rest all along. She smiled. We stayed up there until the sun dipped low, casting everything in golden light. Later that week, we sat at the dining room table, the one Elmer built by hand, and talked through the papers. The trust I had set up, the original deed, the boundaries between her LLC and what I still held. She asked if we could revise it together, not to erase the line, but to make it clearer. She wanted to earn her place this time, not take it. It was the first time in months I saw something honest in her eyes. Not ambition, not strategy, just regret and hope. We spent 3 evenings going over everything. I called Lois, and she agreed to draw up a joint agreement, one that protected both of us, but left room for real partnership. Not business. Family. On the final day, Melanie asked if she could add something to the property plan. She wanted to designate part of the land near the big willow tree as a memorial garden, a place to plant native flowers and keep Elmer's old bench. She said she would place no signage, no plaques, just a space for breath. I said yes. When the papers were signed, she didn't celebrate. She just folded them neatly and placed them in the drawer next to my prayer cards. That night we walked the edge of the property together. We didn't say much. The moon was high. The creek whispered the same stories it always had. I looked at her and realized something I hadn't seen until now. She had stopped trying to be the next big thing and started remembering what it meant to belong. Back in the house, she made chamomile tea and left a cup on the windowsill for me, just like I used to do for her during her college years. I watched her head upstairs without a word, quiet and steady. Then I sat down with my tea, the steam rising gently into the night. The house was still, and for the first time in a long time, I no longer felt like a guest in my own life. The following week arrived with a breeze cooler than the last. Early signs of fall whispered through the trees, leaves curling at their edges, shadows growing longer. Everything began to soften in tone, like the land itself was preparing to let go. I was in the root cellar organizing jars when Melanie tapped lightly on the doorframe. She had a folded paper in her hand. Her face was calm, but I could see the weight behind her eyes. She said she wanted to host a dinner, just family, nothing fancy, no guests, no photos. I looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. The truth was, I hadn't sat around that dining table with the whole family since the 4th of July 2 years ago. That day had ended in raised voices and too many half-truths, but something about the way she asked made me believe she wasn't putting on a show this time. We spent the next few days getting things ready. She helped me polish the silver. I helped her gather apples for the pie. It felt like old rhythms, mother and daughter, not partners, not opponents. Just two women learning each other again. The night of the dinner, the house filled slowly. First came her brother Harris and his wife with their twins. Then came Aunt Noreen, who still brought her famous vinegar slaw and wore the same brooch she'd worn at Elmer's funeral. Even Lois stopped by early to help warm the rolls. No one mentioned the past year. No one brought up the blog or the film crew or the almost sale of the property. It was as if we all knew not to poke the bruises until they faded a bit more. The food was simple but good. Roast chicken with herbs from the garden, creamy potatoes, stewed green beans with bacon. Melanie had added a butternut squash tart she had found in one of my older cookbooks. She didn't alter it. She made it exactly as written, crust and all. After dinner, Melanie stood to speak. She cleared her throat, and for a moment I saw her hand tremble just slightly as she held her wineglass. She thanked everyone for coming. Then she paused. She said she knew she had made mistakes, that in trying to honor legacy, she had almost erased it, that in chasing growth, she had overlooked the ground it grew from. She looked right at me. She said she had forgotten that people are not projects, that homes are not ideas, and that stories do not belong to the one who tells them best, but to those who lived them first. The room fell into that kind of hush you only find in deep woods or deep truths. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said she would be stepping back from the business entirely, that she had been accepted into a teaching fellowship at the local college focusing on rural food systems. Something quiet, something rooted. She said the land needed her in a different way now, not to shine, but to sustain. A few gasps came from the table. Her brother blinked twice. Aunt Noreen covered her mouth. I didn't say anything. Not yet. After everyone left, I stood in the kitchen rinsing pie plates when Melanie came beside me with a towel. She said she didn't know if it would fix things. I told her I wasn't looking for fixes. I was waiting for her to arrive. That night, before going to bed, I walked out to the memorial garden we had started sketching together. Just the bare patch of grass under the willow where Elmer's bench would eventually sit. I stood there with my arms folded across my chest, letting the moonlight cover the earth he once tilled by hand. I heard her footsteps before I saw her. She came and stood beside me, quiet. Then she reached into her coat pocket and handed me an envelope. Inside was a new draft of the land agreement. It named me sole trustee again. The LLC was dissolved. She had drawn up the final release. She said she knew I could have forced this, but it mattered more to her now to do it right than to do it fast. I folded the paper and slid it into my apron pocket. Then I reached for her hand. It had taken a year, 1,000 missteps, and a silence heavy enough to bury us both. But that night I felt something shift for good. Not because everything was perfect, but because we had finally chosen to be present, and presence is where healing begins. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Morning began slow. I would sit on the porch with a blanket across my lap, coffee in hand, while the mist crawled across the pasture. Melanie often joined me, her own cup held close, her voice softer now, more willing to sit in silence. We didn't speak much about the dinner or the papers she handed me under the willow. Something didn't need words anymore. What mattered most was how her actions had changed. She stopped running. She started listening. That shift wasn't small. It lived in the way she handled things around the house. She didn't try to manage it like a brand anymore. She just showed up. She swept the porch without being asked. She washed her own linens. When a pipe under the sink gave out, she knelt beside me and held the flashlight without checking her phone once. She had gone from visitor to caretaker, from owner in theory to steward in spirit. One morning she brought down a box from the attic. It was labelled in Elmer's handwriting, County Ledger, 1979 to 1987. She said she wanted to understand how we had managed the property back then. I sat with her at the table and opened the yellowed files, walking her through every invoice, every tax stub, every hand-noted budget Elmer had kept in his neat, stubborn penmanship. We ran our fingers over history. Melanie asked if we could recreate one of the old ledgers in digital form, not to change it, but to preserve it. I nodded. She didn't ask for passwords. She didn't rush. She just listened as I talked her through how we saved each year, how Elmer never once missed a note. That evening, as the last light pulled across the fields, she asked me if I ever thought I'd be here at this stage of life, rebuilding a bond I thought I had lost. I told her I didn't expect anything anymore, but I had learned to hold space for what might still come. The next weekend, we cleaned out the canning shed together. It had been leaning for years, roof half-split windows fogged with age and dust. Inside, old aprons hung like ghosts, and the last of the jar labels had curled from the heat of so many summers. Melanie found one jar tucked in the back, a peach preserve from 1994. She held it like treasure, even though it had long since turned. She asked if we could rebuild the shed, not as a store, not as an exhibit, just as a place to make things again, real things, with our hands. The idea didn't sparkle with the urgency of a startup. It settled into us like a warm coat, familiar, honest. We spent the next few days mapping out what it would take. I called an old neighbour who worked with reclaimed wood. Melanie priced out new sealant for the roof. She had stopped looking at everything like a product. She was learning to see it as part of us. By mid-October, we had cleared the brush around the old structure. The wood still smelled of sugar and dust. And as we pried away the damaged panels, I noticed something I hadn't seen in years. There, carved deep into the wall beam, were our initials: mine, Elmer's, Melanie's, a heart drawn in a child's hand. I traced it with my finger and stepped back. Melanie didn't say anything. She just nodded and kept working. We patched the roof. We repainted the trim. We cleaned the windows until light came through again. It wasn't perfect. That wasn't the point. It was real. And real had been missing for a long time. That Friday I stood outside as the sun dipped low. The shed caught the gold of the day's last light. Inside, jars lined the shelves again. Not full yet, but ready. Melanie walked up beside me, brushing dirt from her jeans. She said she had declined a podcast interview earlier that week. Someone from a wellness platform wanted her to talk about rural reinvention. She said she told them no, because this wasn't reinvention. It was return. I didn't respond. But I felt something inside my chest shift, less ache, more warmth. That night before bed, she left a note on the kitchen table. It wasn't long, just one line in her handwriting. You were never the one who left. I folded it once, tucked it into the recipe book Elmer had started for her when she was 10. Then I turned off the lights, let the stillness settle, and walked upstairs to sleep, beneath a roof that for the first time in a long while felt like home again. The air had changed again. November carried with it a different kind of quiet. Not the hush of summer dusk or the stillness of spring mornings, but the deep, steady silence of a year preparing to close. The garden beds had been put to rest. The last of the firewood was stacked against the shed, and in the mornings, frost dusted the window panes like lace. Melanie had stayed through it all. She didn't ask for anything more. She simply made herself part of the rhythm. Some days she'd rise before me and start coffee. Other times I'd find her walking the fence line in her old boots, hands tucked in her coat pockets, face turned toward the hills. There was no plan in place, no schedule, just presence. One Sunday we sat side by side in the old church pew, third row from the back. It was the same pew Elmer and I had sat in for 38 years. The choir sang slower these days, and the heater ticked with age, but the room held. That morning, Pastor Ray spoke about forgiveness not as an event, but as a space, a clearing made not for the one who hurt you, but for yourself, a place where pain could settle without taking root. Melanie didn't look at me during the sermon, but I could feel her hand tremble slightly when she placed the hymnal back into the rack. That night she came into my room and sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't speak at first, just stared at the quilt, tracing the patterns with her fingers. Then she told me she had written something, not a post, not a pitch, a letter, to Elmer. She said it was something she had needed to do for a long time. She asked if I would read it when I was ready. I waited until the next morning. I made tea, sat by the fire, and opened the envelope she had left on the kitchen table. It was not polished. It wasn't designed to win anyone over. It was raw. She wrote about how she had misunderstood what strength looked like, how she had chased approval and forgot about roots. She wrote about the time she skipped Elmer's birthday to close a funding deal, and how she had justified it in the name of legacy. She wrote about the distance she had put between us, not out of malice, but out of pride. And she ended with a sentence I'll never forget. She said, "If I ever rebuild anything worth leaving behind, it will be because I finally sat still long enough to learn what you were trying to teach me." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the cedar box, where Elmer's letters to me still rested bound by ribbon. Later that day, we stood at the edge of the clearing behind the pasture where the memorial bench had finally been set. Melanie carried a mason jar of wildflowers. I brought the small bronze plaque we had ordered a few weeks earlier. It read simply, "For the hands that built this." We placed the jar beside the bench. The flowers shivered slightly in the wind. She knelt down, brushed some dirt away from the base, and pressed her palm to the wood, as if anchoring herself to the ground. She didn't cry, not visibly, but her shoulders folded forward and her breath caught, and that was enough to say everything. As we walked back toward the house, she asked if we could begin writing down some of the stories, mine, Elmer's, the family's. Not for publishing, not for show, just for keeping. She wanted the truth in paper, unpolished, unbranded. I told her we could start tomorrow. That night I sat in the dining room after she had gone to bed, flipping through the oldest photo album we had. There was one picture I lingered on. Melanie, age 8, with her knees scraped and her arms full of wildflowers, grinning up at me from the front step. The light in her eyes hadn't changed. It had only been buried. The house felt different now. Not perfect, not healed, but real. And for the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me too. Not just relief, not just peace, but readiness for whatever came next. The first snow arrived quietly, blanketing the fields in soft white just before dawn. I stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the wind carry flakes sideways across the barn roof. The world outside looked still again, like it was holding its breath. Inside the house, Melanie moved slowly but not out of hesitation. Her steps were grounded now. She no longer rushed, no longer tried to fill every silence. She had grown into the quiet. That morning, we began organizing the notebooks we had started together. Each one held fragments of our story recipes, planting records, journal entries, letters from Elma, and memories neither of us wanted to forget. They weren't arranged by date or category, just stacked like stones, holding shape by meaning, not order. Melanie brought in an old wooden cabinet from the shed. We wiped it clean and tucked the notebooks inside, along with the ledger she had digitized and printed again. We didn't say much, but I noticed the small brass label she had screwed into the cabinet door. It read, "Kept." Later that week, I walked out to the garden with my spade, the one with the worn handle and initials burned into the grip. I wasn't planting anything, not in December. But I wanted to turn the soil one more time. I wanted to feel the weight of the earth. Melanie followed me out with 2 mugs of tea and a blanket draped over her shoulders. She didn't interrupt. She simply sat on the bench and watched. I dug 1 row, then paused. My knees weren't what they used to be, and the cold stung my knuckles. But the work felt good, familiar, honest. She asked if she could finish the row. I handed her the spade. She pressed it down and lifted the soil the same way Elma used to show her. Not perfect, but steady. When she reached the end, she leaned on the handle and looked up. There was dirt on her cheek, wind in her hair, and I saw it plain as day. She belonged again. That evening, as we lit the fire and prepared dinner, Melanie pulled a small wrapped box from the pantry shelf. She said it wasn't much, just something she had found at a roadside antique store. I unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a frame, an old photograph. Me and Elma. Young, still unsure, still learning, but smiling with the kind of ease that comes only when you believe you are home. She said she thought the kitchen wall looked a little empty. I hung the photo above the pantry door. Just before bedtime, she asked if we could host a meal next week. Not a production, just a gathering. A few neighbors, some family, quiet stories, real food. I nodded. It was the first time in a long while I had said yes to something without holding anything back. And that night, as I lay under the old quilt, the one Elma's mother had pieced together during the first winter of their marriage, I felt a calm settle deep inside me. Not because the wounds were gone, but because they had finally stopped bleeding. Some stories do not end with revenge or grand gestures. Some end quietly, with presence, with peace, with the kind of forgiveness that doesn't demand anything but truth. And for me, that was enough. If this story touched something in you, maybe reminded you of a silence that lingered too long, or a moment when forgiveness didn't come easy, just know you're not alone. Sometimes the loudest pain is the one we carry in quiet. Leave a comment if this story echoes your own. And if you're still waiting for someone to come home to you, whether in words or in spirit, keep holding your truth. It matters. You matter. And healing, even in small steps, still counts. Thank you for listening.